Awesome. I think we're ready to go. So tonight's lesson is chapter 4. So we'll finish our study of chapter Ruth tonight, sort of. We're going to finish the chapters, but we're going to continue talking about Ruth for several more weeks. Tonight's chapter has a whole lot to do with the book of Revelation. That's what we're going to be studying for the next lesson. So I'm going to try and focus on the lesson at hand and not jump ahead into Ruth and Revelation. But for those of you that were here for that study, I want you to be thinking about the themes, think about the setup and all the things that go on and how that reminds us of the book of Revelation. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the redemption. We're going to be talking about Ruth becomes the bride of Boaz, and we're going to be talking about how Naomi has her land restored. Oh, I'm so sorry. Spoiler alert, right? And Naomi will have her land restored. This is really important when we look at this from a typological perspective. So we're considering Ruth as a picture of the church. We're considering Naomi as a type of Israel. And of course, Boaz is a foreshadow of Jesus. And so we've gone into the details in that over the last several lessons. So looking at what happens to these people in their lives and how they end up where they end up, they were real people, and these things really did happen to them, and these were their actual lives. But God is using their lives to tell a bigger story, which to me is absolutely amazing. So we know that Naomi left the land of Israel and went and sojourned in the land of the Moabites, or the land of the Gentiles, where she lost her husband and her 2 sons. And we talked about how it's a picture of the separation of Israel and God in the Old Testament, and how the 2 kingdoms, the northern and southern kingdoms, did go into exile, and when they went into exile, they basically dissolved. But Naomi hears that there's bread in the land, and she returns back to the promised land, and this time she brings Ruth with her. So Naomi and Ruth get acquainted in the land of the Gentiles, and then they return to the land together, and Ruth is extremely devoted to Naomi. And we understand her compassion, we understand her devotion, because that's how a Christian feels about Israel. So if we don't quite understand what should a Christian's perspective be on Israel, what's the biblical view? Well, Ruth teaches us a very important lesson. She left her gods behind. She left her old life behind. It cost her a lot. It was a brave decision, but she stays close to Naomi, and she follows her back to the promised land. And because of her devotion to Naomi, she ends up meeting Boaz, who's a picture of the Savior. So it shows us that the church is devoted to Israel. We know that Israel took care of the scriptures. They are the ones that were chosen and brought out of Egypt. And God raised up prophets in Israel. And he did that so that Israel would bring the word to the world. And so they are a gift to the church. And we have a lot of respect, a lot of devotion and care for Israel. Even though at this time they are in a state of unbelief as a corporate nation, they don't recognize Jesus as Messiah. But Romans 11 teaches us that eventually they will be grafted back into that olive tree. So because of Ruth's devotion to Naomi, we understand that the church is also devoted to Israel and very, very respectful. So we've seen how Ruth becomes acquainted with Boaz, the Lord of the harvest, how they share bread and wine together, which is a picture of the bread and wine that Jesus instructed the church to remember him with, his body and his blood, his sacrifice. And we also see now how all things will be resolved by Boaz. He's going to take care of both Ruth and Naomi. So that's what we're focusing on tonight, the happy ending tonight. And we'll go verse by verse as usual. So, who would like to start off and read chapter 4, verse 1? And make sure you speak up really well so we can hear it on the video. Bill?
Okay. Now Boaz went up the gate and sat down there. And behold, a close relative of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, "Come aside, friend, sit down here." So he came aside and sat down.
Okay, so remember, last we saw Boaz and Ruth at the threshing floor. That would have been outside of the city where the fields were. Ruth returns to the city to meet Naomi. Remember, she had 6 measures of meal that she brought to Naomi as a gift from Boaz, and Naomi recognized, oh, that's 6. It's not quite complete. Boaz is going to take care of the matter today. And so they are together in the city, but Boaz goes to the city gate. So the city gate was really important at the time because they didn't have their laptops, they didn't have their phones, they didn't have FaceTime, they didn't have all their connection that we do today. So the city gate would be a place where they frequently passed, going into the city and going out to the fields to harvest, coming back into the city where their homes would be. And so if you wanted to catch someone, it would be at the city gate. So Boaz is looking for that other closer kinsman redeemer. Remember this drama last week? Who's that other closer kinsman redeemer? Boaz makes this promise to Ruth and says, I will do everything that you have asked, but hold on, there's a nearer kinsman. So he has to go and settle it with the nearer kinsman before he can take care of Ruth and Naomi. So he's doing this in the city gate. In the Bible, a lot of important things happen in the city gate. Elders, judges, rulers, and sometimes even the king would sit in the city gate to pass judgments and oversee transactions and official business. So that was their connection place. That's where they would go to text their friends, right? To catch up with everybody else. But we are told that Lot sits in the city gate in Genesis 19:1, King David in 2 Samuel 19:8, Daniel in Daniel 2:49, the husband of the virtuous woman in Proverbs 31:23. And by the way, I think the husband of the virtuous woman is a picture of Jesus, and the virtuous woman is a picture of the church. Read that Proverbs 31 with those new fresh eyes and see what you think about that. But they were all in the city gate. So this is where this whole scene is going to take place.
Esther too.
Esther too, right, absolutely. That's where Mordecai sat, right? Would someone please read verse 2? Just 2.
Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, sit here, and they did so.
Okay, so what can we get out of that? Well, how many elders were there?
10.
10. There were 10 elders in the city gate. So let's talk about that number 10. We talked about it a little bit last week. What does 10 represent in Scripture?
The testimony of God.
Testimony of God, yes. It is a number of completion, like 7. 7 is a number of completion. The testimony of God. When you think of 10 in the Bible, what pops into your mind?
10
Commandments,
10
the
commandments.
plagues,
10
the
plagues.
lepers.
Oh, you're good. 10 lepers. I didn't think of that one.
10 virgins.
10 virgins.
10 virgins.
Yes. 5 wise, 5 foolish. What about from our study of Revelation? 10 horns. Good job. 10 horns, which are related to the 10 toes. So there's a lot of 10s in the Scripture. 10 commandments. We can think of the commandments as representative of the entire law. So a lot of times 10 has to do with the complete law. It also has to do with the Gentile kingdoms because of the 10 horns and the 10 toes. So we do have this number planted in here, and it's associated with the elders. Boaz is going to the city gate to carry out a transaction for Naomi's land, and he's going to do it according to the law. He's going to do it in a very public way, according to the law. Now, another interesting connection is when Abraham sent his servant to go get Rebecca and bring her back home, he traveled with camels. Any idea how many camels he took? 10. 10. Good answer. How did you figure that out? So that's another picture of the retrieval of the bride, and the 10 camels are mentioned there. Here we have the 10 elders. So I think that's all very interesting connections. How many elders are in the temple, in the heavenly temple in the book of Revelation?
Well, let's go with 10.
Wrong.
Oh, no.
Wrong.
24.
I set you up for that one. Good job. 24 elders.
Well, there's only 10 good ones.
I don't know. They are in heaven, the heavenly temple, around the throne. So 24 elders in the heavenly temple surrounding the throne. So it's a little different. We will talk about, again, the relationship between Ruth and Revelation. I think we do have an interesting connection between the elders here, but the numbers are different. But what we can see here is Boaz is dealing very publicly, and he's going to follow the law very carefully, but he does it in a very witty and cunning way. So would someone please read verses 3 and 4?
And he said to the kinsman redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from Moab, selling the piece of land that belonged to our brother Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here, and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line.
Okay, so Boaz has seen the nearer kinsman. What does he suggest first? What does he offer up to the nearest kinsman? What does he say? That he buys it. And what is it that it is for sale here?
Naomi's land.
Naomi's land. So he asks the nearer kinsman about the land. Now we know that Ruth and Naomi go along with the land, but he's not revealing that detail at this time. So he says there's this piece of land which would enrich this man if he were able to buy it and to farm it and to take care of it. So it would add to his estate. And so he's going to reveal his true heart, this nearer kinsman, that he's going to be interested in this parcel of land. But there's a twist. We know what's coming, that Ruth goes along with it. So Boaz is very wise. He says, hey, there's this great piece of land. Are you interested? So he begins with that. And I think he is very wise, and I imagine him being very patient, but he's like, if you want to redeem it, because if you don't, I'm next. That almost seems like, come on, I'm next, hurry up. He almost shows that he's anxious to get the land. But why is it that this land is for sale in the first place?
She can't take care of it.
She can't take care of it, right? She has no husband. She can't take care of the land, afford it by herself. She can't go out and get a job. She is an older woman, so not that she could go out and get married and take care of the land that way. Ruth is a foreigner, so there's a lot of things working against her. So she's appealing to this law of the kinsman redeemer in hopes that someone will redeem her land. That's described again in Leviticus 25:25. If thy brother be waxen poor and hath sold away some of his possession, and if any of his kin come to redeem it, then he shall redeem that which his brother has sold. So if we look at this as this is Israel's land, or again if we look at it as a picture of the earth itself, Adam originally was given dominion over the earth in Genesis chapter 1, but he lost that dominion, right? How is it that Adam lost the dominion of the earth? Because of sin, right? He fell into the debt of sin, and because of that, he lost his dominion over the earth. We know that the nearer kinsman law talks about someone falling into poverty, coming upon hard times, being unable to take care of the land. Well, that's exactly what happens to Adam whenever he sins. Israel had lost her land a couple of times, first in the Babylonian captivity. That was due to the idolatry that they engaged in. And then later on, again in 70 AD. Remember, they were back in the land for a little while, but then in 70 AD, they were exiled to the ends of the earth at that time. That was after the rejection of the Messiah. So because they had fallen into idolatry, the rejection of the Messiah, they also lost that promised land. But God has begun to restore them to the land, as we've seen in our times. So the big question is, who is this nearer kinsman? Or at least, what does he represent? We talked about some possibilities last week. It couldn't be an angel, because that wouldn't be someone that's a blood relative. We talked about the possibility that it represents the law. The law, if a man is able to follow the law exactly and be perfect before God, then he doesn't need a kinsman redeemer. But there's no other human on earth other than Jesus who's been able to keep that law. So no man can save himself. We're all dependent on that kinsman redeemer, Jesus. But if it represents the law, that would be consistent with that number 10 as a symbol here. But do notice, this nearer kinsman was willing to purchase the land. He was very interested in the land. But of course, there's a twist, and that is Ruth the Moabitess. So would someone please read verses 5 and 6?
Then Boaz said, on the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you must also buy it from Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of the dead, to perpetuate the name of the dead through his inheritance. And the close relative said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I ruin my own inheritance. You redeem my right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it.
All right, so his heart has been revealed. He's interested in the land, but now that the twist has been introduced, as soon as you buy it, you're also going to get the hand of Ruth, the Moabitess, from the one from Moab that, remember, Israel doesn't mingle well with because of their history. But once you buy the land, you're also going to get Ruth along with it. Okay, so what do you suppose are the practical reasons that the nearer kinsman backs out and says, oh, no, never mind, I don't want it?
His wife would be upset.
His wife might be a little upset, right? Can you imagine coming home, hey, honey, how was your day? Oh, great, I picked up another wife today. Yeah, that probably wouldn't go
Bought
very
one
well.
at the gate.
Found her at the gates, right? That's where they all hang out. Yeah, not a good thing. So there could have been that issue. By the way, this law of levirate marriage would permit polygamy. So if someone already had a wife, but he had a responsibility to his brother's wife, he could still take another wife. That was legal at the time. But again, it wouldn't go well with the other wife.
So he didn't know the rules, apparently. The
Well-
son, the kinsman redeemer, didn't know the rules.
He probably did, but he does have a choice in the matter. But again, I don't think it would have gone well.
Sounds like a surprise to him.
Right, that Ruth's available. What if he had sons? What if he had other children already? And he takes another wife and has another son through Ruth. How would that affect his inheritance?
Divides it even more.
Yes. It would divide up what his sons already stood to inherit even more. And because Ruth was from Moab, it probably would have caused tension. So he's like, I'm not willing to get into that mess at all. And so he starts backing out, much to our gladness. But he is unable, he was willing to buy the land, which meant he had enough money, he was wealthy enough, he could sustain the land. However, it's this factor of the woman that he was not able to deal with. He was unwilling to take this wife. If we're looking at this nearer kinsman as a picture of the law, or mankind's ability to follow the law, we know that it fails for redemption in every single case. Romans 8 verses 3 and 4 says, for what the law could not do, in that it was weak through the flesh, God, sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh, and for sin, condemned sin in the flesh, that the righteousness of the law might be fulfilled in us, who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit. So the law cannot redeem. The law is spiritual, the law is good, it helps us to understand sin, but it cannot redeem. What the law could not do, Jesus could do. What this nearer kinsman could not do, Boaz is going to be able to do. Also, John 1:17, for the law was given by Moses. That came first. That was closer. But grace and truth came by Jesus Christ, the Redeemer. Let's read about the shoe custom. The next few verses are 7 through 8. Who is willing?
I will. Now, in earlier times in Israel, for redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. 7 and 8?
Yes.
I'm sorry. So the kinsman redeemer said to Boaz, buy it yourself, and he removed his sandal.
Okay, so not necessarily one of our customs, but it would be fun to try sometime, right? You buy a house and you're like, oh, thanks. You take off your sandal just to see what the reaction would be. I love it. But it's perfectly understandable, and the Bible can describe it in a couple of ways. We'll look at it in a couple of perspectives. But the removal of the shoe indicates that only the rightful owner of the land may tread upon the land. So the one who hands over the shoe is basically saying, you have the right to walk all over the land. Wherever you set your foot, that is rightfully yours. In fulfillment of his promise to Abram, God later assured Moses and Joshua that wherever they set their foot, that land would belong to them. So on page 2 there, Deuteronomy 11:24, God says to Moses, every place whereon the soles of your feet shall tread shall be yours. Imagine him treading the land in his sandals. And then he reiterated this to Joshua later in Joshua 1:3. Every place that the sole of your foot shall tread upon, that I have given unto you as I have given unto Moses, as I said unto Moses. So when the nearer kinsman turns over his shoe, he's recognizing Boaz's right to walk throughout the land because he will be the owner of the land, the legal owner of the land. However, there's another matter that's involved here from the Old Testament. There is a degree of shame and disgrace upon one who is unable or who refuses to redeem the land of his family or his near relatives, specifically the law of levirate marriage. This is in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 7 through 10. It says, "But if the man does not desire to take his brother's wife, then his brother's wife shall go up to the gate and to the elders and say," so remember, this is happening in the city gate. The elders are present, and this has to do with taking the wife of a deceased brother. So the wife goes up to the brother and says, "My husband's brother refuses to establish a name for his brother in Israel. He is not willing to perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. Then the elders of his city shall summon him and speak to him. And if he persists and says, 'I do not desire to take her,'" now remember, the near kinsman says, "I'm interested in the land, but I don't want that bride," right? "And if he persists and says, 'I do not desire to take her,' then his brother's wife shall come to him in the sight of the elders and pull his sandal off his foot and" what?
Spit in his
"Spit in
face."
his face." This is legal, right? "And she shall declare, 'Thus it is done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. In Israel his name shall be called the house of him whose sandal is removed.'" You know, it would be humbling for that near kinsman to be standing there with one shoe on, having this law in the back of his mind. But this particular law says that the bride-to-be can come and pluck off the shoe of the husband's brother and spit in his face. So I think the fact that this near kinsman takes off his shoe and hands it to Boaz, he's probably like looking around like, is she going to come spit in my
Well,
face?
it doesn't say she can, it
Right?
says she shall.
It's she shall. That's right.
She didn't have a choice.
She has to demonstrate it.
But who takes care of her? She's got, all she got is a sandal with the deal.
That's true. That's true. I know. Go sell it, I suppose.
It's not good.
I suppose. But again, I think he does this sort of preemptively. He knows that it's coming, but there is another willing kinsman redeemer. So he's like, let's kind of skip that part. You can have my shoe, and please don't spit in my face. But I can imagine they're at the city gate. Ruth and Naomi are not in this scene. They're off somewhere. And so I always like to think about what were they doing while this was going on. They didn't know how long it was going to take. When would he run into the nearer kinsman? And so I imagine them up in their house, on their housetop, right on their balcony, and they're like watching the city gate. They've got their binoculars. And then, Naomi's like, oh, he took off his sandal. That's good news. I'm going to have grandchildren, right? Because when she sees that sandal come off, Boaz receives it, that, the deal is done. But let's fast forward. Let's look at Jesus. In the presence of false witnesses, the religious leaders deemed Jesus an unfit kinsman redeemer, whether they knew it or not, when they decided he was not the Messiah. They inspected him, they interviewed him, they put him through the ringer of all of the authorities, and they decided to kill him. As a result, they treated him with dishonor, and what did they do with Jesus? Spit in his face. What they did not realize was that at that very moment, Jesus was paying the price to redeem their land and their nation, even according to the law. Matthew 26 describes this. But Jesus held his peace, and the high priest answered and said unto him, I adjure thee by the living God, that thou tell us whether thou be the Christ, the Son of God. Jesus saith unto him, Thou hast said. Nevertheless I say unto you, hereafter shall ye see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power, and coming in the clouds of heaven. He's quoting Daniel there. Then the high priest rent his clothes, saying, He hath spoken blasphemy. What further need have we of witnesses? Behold, now you have heard his blasphemy. What think ye? They answered and said, He is guilty of death. They were despising him. Then did they spit in his face and buffeted him, and others smote him with the palms of their hands, saying, Prophesy unto us, thou Christ, who is he that smote thee? So they were despising Jesus. They called him a blasphemer. They figured he was unfit. He was not who he said he was. And they spit in his face. They were giving him shame and disgrace, just like the bride could give to the unwilling kinsman redeemer. What they didn't know is he was the only kinsman redeemer, and he was in the process of getting ready to pay the price for the redemption of the land and also the bride. So you can even see a glimmer of that in the story of Jesus. But when a kinsman redeemer would take a bride and have a child through his brother's wife, ultimately he was having that child for his brother. And so it was like life from the dead. The brother's name who had passed away, his line would terminate with his death. But with this law of levirate marriage, his line would continue, at least in a legal sense. And so the name of the deceased was raised up and his line would continue through this law. So it's like raising the dead. And we know that that's why Jesus came. So let's talk about raising the name of the dead. Would someone please read verses 9 and 10?
And Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses this day that I bought all that was Elimelech's and all that was Kilion's and Mahlon's from the hand of Naomi. Moreover, Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of Mahlon, I have acquired as my wife to perpetuate the name of the dead through his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brethren and from his position at the gate. You are witnesses this day."
So who is it that is going to benefit from Boaz's act of kindness? Naomi and Ruth. Two of them, right? Both Naomi and Ruth. What are the results of his actions? What will happen for Naomi?
She has a place
She'll
to
be
live,
fed.
the land lives on.
Yep, she'll get to stay on her land. She'll be fed. Absolutely, she'll be taken care of, provided for. She'll have a family again. If we look at Boaz as a picture of Jesus, who is it that benefits from Jesus' act of kindness?
All of us.
All of us, the world, every single person in the earth, absolutely. The results of his actions, what he paid for on the cross, are also twofold. He will take a bride, he will marry that bride just like Boaz marries Ruth. Ruth is going to have a husband. She'll eventually have children, a family, a place to live. She will no longer be a foreigner. She'll be grafted into the family of Israel. That same thing will be true for the church. The church benefits from what Jesus did on the cross. He died to save humanity. And eventually he will take a bride called the church. He'll take a gentile bride. But also he has a plan to restore the land of Israel. And he has already begun doing that, which is very, very exciting. But Israel will be lifted up to be the head of the nations and again be reinstated to the position that she was originally called to. So Ruth and Naomi both benefit from Boaz's actions. And from what Jesus did, who's the greater Boaz, both the church and Israel will be blessed by his actions. But notice in verse 9, it says, "I have purchased to be my wife, to raise up the name of the dead upon his inheritance, that the name of the dead be not cut off from among his brethren." So you can hear the phrase, he's raising up the name of the dead. We know Jesus goes further than the name, but he actually raises the dead. John 11, verses 25 and 27, Jesus said unto her, "I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. Believest thou this? She saith unto him, Yea, Lord, I believe that thou art the Christ, the Son of God, which should come into the world." So this is a woman that Jesus is talking to. He's explaining who he is. And he says, "I'm the resurrection and the life. If you believe in me, you will never die. And even if you die, you will be raised to life." So he's talking about the rapture. Think about Paul's description of the rapture, that those who have already fallen asleep, those that have died, will be resurrected first, and then those which are alive and remain will be caught up to be with Jesus eternally. So some will die, but even though they die, they will live. Some will have the privilege of being that very last generation that participates in the rapture, where they will be instantly transformed and translated into the heavens, and they will live and never die after that translation. So Jesus is describing that even though there's death, that the name of the dead, and beyond even the name, the humanity will be raised up, of course, those that believe in him. So he's explaining to the woman of the well how this happens. And he asks her, do you believe this? And she says, I believe that thou art the Christ, the Son of God, which should come into the world. And she sets an example for everyone who wants to be saved. How do you be saved? You trust in Jesus. You accept what he did. You confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, and you will be saved. That invitation is open. It has been open for a long time, and it will remain open until Jesus returns. But it's an invitation to salvation, and it's the most important question that anyone could face. He says, believest thou me? And she said, I believe you're the Christ, the Son of God. And that's the confession that the church makes, and that's the confession that we are saved by.
So Elimelech is raised from the dead.
His name. His name, yes.
His
So
genealogy.
his line, he will be credited with those children, and also Mahlon and Chilion, right? So the name of Elimelech plus Mahlon and Chilion, the two sons of Naomi, their names will continue in the genealogies. So in a legal sense, they are raised from the dead, but Jesus goes beyond the legal sense and actually raises men from the dead. It's amazing. In a loud voice, Boaz declares that all who are present are witnesses of this transaction. So the shoe has been given over to Boaz. Nobody got their face spit in, thank goodness. But he announces in a very loud voice the result of this transaction. Can you imagine Naomi and Ruth, if they could witness that, how they would feel?
They were giddy.
They would be giddy, wouldn't they? Right? But Jesus also requires witnesses. Acts 1:8, but ye shall receive power. After that the Holy Ghost has come upon you, and you shall be witnesses unto me both in Jerusalem and in all Judea and in Samaria and unto the uttermost part of the earth. All the way from Jerusalem to the panhandle of Texas into Amarillo, down through time to 2018 where we are today. That always amazes me, how far the gospel has gone and how it's reached all of us. Acts 4:33. And with great power gave the apostles witness of the resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ, and great grace was upon them all. So you know they would be the talk of the town. After Boaz makes his announcement, they would all go out and be talking. Did you hear about Boaz and Ruth? Ruth from Moab. Did you hear about Naomi's land? And this happens with Jesus as well. So Ruth will now be credited for building the house of Israel.
So who is the other closer kinsman?
I don't know.
What was what
They
does,
don't name him.
He doesn't have a name.
so what does he represent?
I don't know.
False prophet.
My great teacher
I don't
knew
know,
what.
it could be the world. Could be
False prophet.
Maybe.
the world.
Couldn't deliver.
Maybe so. Yeah. Becky?
I was thinking, like, it's interesting that Boaz knew who the closer kinsman redeemer was.
Yes.
I don't think Naomi, I mean, it doesn't mention that Naomi does. She knew Boaz was a kinsman,
Right.
but she didn't know about this other guy. But Boaz knows.
Absolutely. So he's been, before Ruth came to him and asked him to fulfill this law, he had probably been checking. He knew exactly what was going on. And yeah, he had a plan for sure. Who is that nearer kinsman? It is still a mystery to me. I've thought about it for a long time. I can see how it represents the law in the fact that the law cannot redeem a soul. And every other human being on the planet, out of every human that's ever lived, there's only been one who is able to redeem. So my nearest relative cannot redeem my soul. No one is able to do it except for Jesus. What we're going to see, I was trying not to get into this, but when we compare Ruth to Revelation, we'll look at a scene in Revelation chapter 4. We're in Ruth chapter 4, we're going to look at Revelation chapter 4. But John is in heaven, he's in the heavenly temple, and he weeps and he weeps. Do we know why? Do you remember why John weeps? Why is he weeping?
Forgot.
Already?
I know.
Is anybody worthy to take the scroll, right? So-
Yeah. No one was found worthy to take the scroll. Remember, the one on the throne has the scroll in his right hand. Revelation chapter 5. Chapter 5, verse 2. And I saw a strong angel proclaiming with a loud voice, "Who is worthy to open the book and to loose the seals thereof?" And no man in heaven, nor in earth, neither under the earth, was able to open the book, neither to look thereon. And I wept much, because no man was found worthy to open and to read the book, neither to look thereon. So this call is made for a nearer kinsman. This is in the heavenly temple. The elders are there in chapter 4. And John weeps and weeps because there is no one worthy to open the book.
All 24 of those elders were there.
They were all there. Yes, all 24 around the throne. And the call is made for the nearer kinsman. Remember, Boaz sees the nearer kinsman, says, "Come on in, let's see if you can take care of business." And he's unable to do it. And then, verse 5, "And one of the elders saith unto me, Weep not. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, hath prevailed to open the book and to loose the 7 seals thereof. And I beheld, and lo, in the midst of the throne, and the 4 beasts, in the midst of the elders, stood a lamb, as it had been slain, having 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God, sent forth into all the earth." So there's a call made for someone to come and open this book, which is in the right hand of the one that sits on the throne. No one can be found in heaven, on earth, or under the earth. So John weeps because he realizes the consequences of this. There's no salvation, there's no redemption of the land, and he weeps and weeps until one of the elders says, "Hang on a minute, there is someone, there is a kinsman redeemer, and it's the Lamb looking as if he had been slain." We know that the Lamb is Jesus Christ. John the Baptist says, "Behold, the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world." He's talking about the Passover lamb, the one that was offered to keep the angel of death away from the houses of the Israelites in Egypt. So there is someone who is worthy, but he is the Lamb who has been slain, and he's the only one in heaven and on earth and under the earth who is able to go and take the scroll and open the 7 seals thereof. And so when Boaz is doing this very public play for Ruth's hand in marriage and Naomi's land, he's giving the nearer kinsman a chance. The nearer kinsman can't do it. Maybe it's because there is no other name by which man can be saved. I think the Bible says that, right? There is no other possible redemption other than the man Jesus Christ. Boaz was the only one that could sustain the land and was willing to take Ruth. Okay, so there is
line 3 has Elimelech referred to as a brother. Is that just like our buddy, our friend? Or?
I'm thinking relative. So Boaz is talking about his blood relative Elimelech. Does that mean he's...
But a brother is more than just a relative. I mean, that's
a very near kinsman.
Yes, it is.
Right? Which verse is that in?
It's the last part of 3.
Verse 3?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, he says, which was our brother Elimelech's. So I would suspect that he's talking in the midst of the elders and the people of Israel. And he's talking about one of their relatives, one of their fellow Israelites.
Yeah.
I don't know if that means his brother, or he's just saying, this is my fellow Israelite, this is my brother Israelite. Because, a brother would be a pretty close relationship.
Close,
what
if
would be
they're all
closer
3
than
brothers.
Yeah.
It might, in the ESV version, it says relative.
It says relative? Yeah. Maybe our brother is just that familiar term. Is a possibility. Any other questions? Did we read 11 and 12 yet? No. Okay, Sierra?
Then the elders and all of the people at the gate said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, who Tamar bore to Judah."
Awesome reading. Good job with all the names. That's always a challenge. So, everyone is celebrating. This is a happy union. Why do you suppose Leah and Rachel are honored here? What's important about Leah and Rachel? What did they do for the house of Israel? Yeah,
Actually, the start of the big
Four
things.
sons.
That's right. They were the mothers of the 12 tribes. There was actually 4 mothers. Jacob had 4 wives, but Leah and Rachel each had a slave or a maidservant, but they're credited with building up the house of Israel. And so the witnesses, the elders, are recognizing that Ruth is now stepping into the house of Israel, and she's going to build up the house of Israel with her offspring. But it's really interesting that Perez and Zerah are mentioned in this passage. Perez and Zerah would have lived in the region of Bethlehem, so they would have been the ancestors that were there. But these were the 2 twins born to Tamar by Judah. You remember this story?
Yes.
What law did Tamar use to get Judah to father her 2 sons?
No, she had his
This law
sandals.
lever.
His king.
Did he have a sandal?
She had his
That's
stuff.
right. She did have his stuff. She had his
She had the
staff,
good
More
stuff.
than a
his
sandal.
ring, and
That's right.
you wonder if she kept his sandal too. So she was faithful under this same law, but she appealed to the law of levirate marriage just like Ruth has done. But let's read about Perez and Zerah. Those were the twin sons born to Tamar by Judah. Judah, the 4th son of Jacob. So it came about, Genesis 38 verses 27 and 30. It came about at the time she was giving birth that, behold, there were twins born in her womb. Moreover, it took place while she was giving birth. One put out a hand, and the midwife took and tied a scarlet thread on his hand, saying, this one came out first. But it came about as he drew back his hand that, behold, his brother came out. Then she said, what a breach you have made for yourself. So he was named Perez. Afterward, his brother came out who had the scarlet thread on his hand, and he was named Zerah. So the firstborn was Perez. His name means breach or eruption. This is what the midwife said there. And Zerah came out second, and Zerah means dawning or rising of light. So Zerah sticks out his hand. And what do they tie on his hand?
Scarlet thread.
A scarlet thread. What a fascinating study. There's another video, if you're interested in watching. It's the video on the red heifer. It's on our channel if you want to watch it. But the scarlet that's mentioned in the sacrifice of the red heifer is mentioned here. Also the scarlet thread that Rahab, the scarlet cord that Rahab put out in her window. If you do a study on that and you follow the scarlet thread, it's even in the outfit of the high priest. I hate to call it the outfit, but it's in his ceremonial clothes. And it was also part of the veil. So this scarlet thread throughout the Bible is really, really fascinating. And it's mentioned here on the hand of the firstborn, but there was a breach, right? So let's try and understand what's going on. Like Zerah, Israel carries the scarlet thread or the bloodline of the Messiah and will come forth gloriously again at the end of the age, right? So the arm goes out and then it goes back in and then Perez is born and then Zerah is born again. Israel began as the chosen people of God. There's been an interruption in the function of the nation of Israel. And since Pentecost, the church has been being formed. But now we see Israel is back into the land. God is using them again, and they're going to come back to the light once again, just like Zerah did. Like Perez, the church breaches the story of Israel and becomes a co-heir. Now, it's really interesting that the story of Perez and Zerah, not only that it shows up in Ruth, because she's a picture of the church, but also where it shows up in Genesis, I think is fascinating. In Genesis 37, we began the story of Joseph, son of Jacob, and we know that he is a very clear, he's one of the most amazing types of Christ in the Old Testament in the details of his life. So his story begins in Genesis 37, and we read about the brothers rejecting Joseph and putting him into the cistern, selling him off to Egypt. That's in Genesis 37. And then there's this chapter 38, and 38 talks about the disobedience of Judah, the 4th born son of Jacob. We have the shining example of Joseph's righteousness and obedience, and then we go to chapter 38, and it's talking about Judah, and he was out looking for a prostitute, right? This is Judah, whom we named the Lion of the tribe of Judah. And he encounters Tamar. He doesn't know that it's his daughter-in-law, and the story goes on, and he ends up fathering Perez and Zerah. So this happens in Genesis 38. And then in Genesis 39, it goes back to Joseph, the story of Joseph, the story of... And I thought, well, that's not organized very well. Why did you interrupt the story of Joseph to tell me what's going on with Judah and Perez and then go back to the story of Joseph? Have y'all ever noticed that? It's really interesting. But the story of Joseph, type of Christ, the details of his life are so close to the details of Jesus. It's absolutely amazing. Some of you were here when we did Shadows of Messiah. The story of Joseph is interrupted by the misbehavior of Judah and this breach, Perez and Zerah. And if we look at Zerah as a picture of Israel and the breach, Perez being the church that's interrupting the story of Israel, and we know Zerah will eventually come back to life, just like Israel will come back to life, then it makes perfect sense that it's in chapter 38. Because the story of the church interrupts the story of Israel. It happens during a time of Israel's disobedience and the fact that they're not in faith. They don't believe in Jesus, but we know they will come to faith because the Bible tells us so.
So Perez is Gentile?
No, he's from Tamar and Judah.
Right, but he represents the Gentiles.
Yes, I could see him
He
as a
stepped
picture.
in front.
Yeah, he's a picture of the interruption of the church. So it's, just pattern after pattern. It's absolutely fascinating. But you could say that Perez and Zerah breached the story of Joseph in the same way the formation of the church has been during the time of Israel's exile after their rejection of Christ. The church age can be found in other breaches. Daniel 9:24 through 27, that's the story of Daniel's 70 weeks. We know there's 69 weeks, and there's a very long break, and then the 70th week occurs. So there's a breach there. Also, Isaiah 61, you could even say Revelation 12, from the man-child being caught up to the woman fleeing into the desert. If we see the man-child being caught up as a picture of Jesus' ascension, well, the woman doesn't flee into the desert until the 70th week of Daniel. So that's a big time span in a couple of verses there. And many say that man-child being caught up is a picture of the church being caught up to heaven, which I also agree with that as well. Looks like Jesus on a singular scale, but the body follows the head. Jesus is the head of the body, and so the man-child caught up is also like the church being caught up into heaven. So Perez and Zerah are mentioned in the story of Ruth. Ruth is a picture of the church. The church is an interruption of Israel's history, and so it all fits together like puzzle pieces. It's fascinating.
It's good stuff, this Bible.
It is. And the thing about the Bible is it is so simple. And you're like, that was not simple what you just explained. It is so simple. You can read the Bible and you can understand it. I got this letter from my insurance company. I'm working on Ruth stuff. And this letter was front and back. It had so many terms, so much vocabulary that I don't know. And it was so complicated. I had no idea. It was very, legalistic. I had no idea what it was about. It was so complicated. We complicate things. But then you read the Bible and the laws are simple. Take off your sandal and spit in their face. I get that, right? Makes sense. But God's word is for everyone. It is for the child. The child can understand it. The person without any education can understand it. The person who cannot read can hear it and understand it. It is very, very simple. But it is also very deep and very rich, and there's treasure there, and you can continue to discover. It's a living book. The Word of God is living and active. So you get the simple story, but then the book is alive, and you learn from it new stuff. Even reading the same scriptures over and over, you learn things new over and over again. It's fantastic. Okay, let's finish this book. This is exciting. We get to finish the book together. Okay? Read real loud, okay?
Genealogy of David. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. Then he went to her, and the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The woman said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a kinsman redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." Then Naomi took the child, laid him in her lap, and cared for him. The women living there said, "Naomi has a son." and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. This is the family line of Perez. Perez was the father of Hezron. Hezron was the father of Ram. Ram was the father of Abinadab. Abinadab was the father of Nashon. Nashon was the father of Solomon. Solomon the father of Boaz. Boaz the father of Obed. Obed the father of Jesse. And Jesse the father of David.
Okay, great reading. One time Willow and I were laughing. She was reading this and she said, "This guy's name is Salmon?" Or Salmon? I think we pronounced his name Salmon. That was so funny though. Right? So simple, even a child can understand. So we have the genealogy here of David. Yes, sir?
I have a question about Obed.
Yes.
Does Obed look upon Boaz as his father or upon Nashon as his father?
Upon
Mahlon?
I think legally he would have been of the line of Mahlon, but Boaz would have been his father, like Joseph was the father of Jesus. So he was the one that was there,
Okay.
you know, so he would call him dad.
He would be in the genealogy of Mahlon.
Yes, yes, legally. So whatever Mahlon stood to inherit would now pass on to Boaz's son.
But Obed, would he be in line for some of Boaz's property also?
Yes,
So he'd be a double dipper.
he'd be doubly blessed. Double dipper. That's great. He's a double dipper. So,
If Mahlon was legally the father, like why in the genealogy, like in Matthew, was Boaz is the father and Ruth is the mother instead of Mahlon? Looks like
right.
Israel is so particular, in the genealogies, it looks like it would list Mahlon as the father.
Right,
instead
that's a
of
really good
Boaz.
point. That's a really good point. I would suspect, and I could be wrong about this, but he would be the legal son of Mahlon. So again, anything that was Mahlon's, anything that he stood to inherit at that particular time, he would have been reckoned as the son of Mahlon. But again, he'd be double dipping, he would be the son of Boaz. So it is interesting that Boaz is mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus and not Mahlon. So it would
But
be
genetically, Joseph had nothing to do with Jesus' DNA.
Right. Well, and there's two genealogies for Jesus. Matthew's goes through Joseph, so it shows the legal right to the throne. But Luke's genealogy goes through Mary, and so he has the bloodline. So he gets the legal right to the throne, but through Mary's line, there was a curse that happened as far as inheriting the throne went, but she provided the bloodline. So there's two lines that are described pointing to Jesus. So that could be the case too, where they just specifically chose to go through Boaz, because again, they went through Joseph and they went through Mary to illustrate Jesus' legitimacy. So we have 10 generations that are listed here. David was the 10th from Perez. So they go back to this breach, Perez, and then all the way to David. Perez was born of a questionable, though legal, union. And then David was the first true king of Israel. So Deuteronomy 23 talks about the 10th generation, someone that comes out of an illegitimate union. It says, even to his 10th generation shall he not enter into the congregation of the Lord. And then notice what it says. An Ammonite or Moabite, Ruth was Moabite, shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord, even to their 10th generation shall they not enter into the congregation of the Lord forever. But David was the 10th from Perez, right? And it's just interesting that number 10 is there. But it was Solomon, his son, who had built the temple. I believe that law is probably referring to the male line as well, because we can see that Ruth has been grafted in. She is now Boaz's full-fledged wife. She is in Israel. She is now an Israelite related to Naomi, and all is well. But with the birth of Obed, the servant, this breach has been healed. Ruth's widowhood has been redeemed, and Naomi's land has been redeemed. Boaz will care for both of them for the rest of their lives. Similarly, under the care of Jesus, the church and Israel will be unified and always provided for. Ruth becomes one of the 4 women mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus, according to Matthew 1. She was a foreigner, a Gentile, a Moabitess, but notice she's been grafted into Israel. She's now part of their nation. Legally, she's the wife of Boaz, and this is true also of the church. In Romans 11:17, it describes, and if some of the branches be broken off, those are the natural branches of the nation of Israel, and thou, being a wild olive tree, that's us Gentiles, were grafted in among them, and with them partakest of the root and fatness of the olive tree. So the church is grafted into the nation of Israel, and that's what we see with Ruth. She was a foreigner, a Gentile, but she has been grafted into the family. Boaz cares for both of them forever. So that little tiny 4-chapter book tells a simple and quaint and beautiful story of these individuals, but it's also very complex in that it's telling the history of Israel and the church and the eschatological implications there, that Jesus will take his bride and restore the land of Israel. So it's a rich lesson. We learn a lot about what our attitude should be about Israel, and it's really amazing.
Boaz's mother's interesting.
She is.
That's a whole other story.
And that could be why he's so gentle with Ruth the foreigner. Yeah, we're going to talk about that a lot. Any other questions or comments? Yes, ma'am.
I like what you said about how the Bible is a really simple message, but you can get deeper and deeper and more complex. But no matter if you look at the simple text, or if you go into the symbolism and get deeper and deeper, it still all says the same thing.
Yes.
No matter how you scrutinize it or look at it, it holds up.
It's very consistent. One of my favorite scriptures talks about Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He doesn't change. So much in our world is tumultuous and it changes and it turns over, but he's consistent and steady, and that's comforting. The Bible's consistent as well. Yes, ma'am?
So when do you leave?
I leave Monday. I leave Monday the 8th, and I'll be back Thursday, October 18th.
Who's gonna hold down the fort for everything while you're gone?
My husband.
He's gonna teach your calculus classes too?
I don't think so. Not quite.
Geez, that'd be fun to read.
I got them well covered.
You mean to go up there?
I think we're good.
Okay.
Appreciate y'all.
I think you should say, yeah, go.
We are covered. Kim?
Your sweet mom asked if we might pray over you
I
tonight.
think that's a great
And
idea.
so I think we gather around and lay hands, and I will start, and anybody who wants to say a little prayer for Shannon and her really cool trip to Israel, and
And my kiddos, please pray
join
for me
in.
today.
Yes,